Headtopics.com. China to ramp up military spending by 7.2%, eclipsing rate of economic growth. China to ramp up military spending by 7.2%. It's planning to surge its defense budget by that much, a higher rate of expansion than its 5% economic growth for 2023, or at least its objective for 2023. It's the national budget unveiled Sunday. China allocated 1.55 trillion won, 224 billion, to its military as geopolitical tensions with the West over the status of Taiwan and the South China Sea loom, the Associated Press reported. For comparison, the U.S. has authorized roughly 858 billion for the fiscal year of 2023, so that's about 4 times more. Trump commented, "I doubt that China is more dangerous than Iran. Our armed forces, with a focus on the goals for the centenary of the People's Liberation Army in 2027, should work to carry out military operations, boost combat preparedness, and enhance military capabilities," Premier Li Keqiang said, per the report. And from Asia News Network, Chinese government proposes 7.2% rise in defense budget to 225 billion. China's planned defense spending for this year will reach 1.55 trillion won, or 224 billion a year-on-year increase of 7.2%, according to a draft budget report submitted to the annual session of China's top legislature on Sunday morning. The draft budget report, which was prepared for the Ministry of Finance, was deliberated on at the opening meeting of the first session of the 14th National People's Congress in Beijing. If approved by lawmakers, the proposed defense budget will maintain single-digit growth for will maintain single-digit growth for it will maintain single-digit growth for the 8th consecutive year. At the NPC session last year, a defense budget of 1.5 trillion won was proposed, up 7.1% year on year. A defense budget of 1.45 trillion won, up 7.1%. And the figure for 2021 was 1.35 trillion won, up 6.8%. The annual government work report delivered at Sunday's opening meeting of the 14th NPC session said that China's national defense and military development have made remarkable achievements over the past year, and the military has effectively safeguarded national sovereignty, security, and interests. The work report noted that the military would continue to make all efforts to implement Xi Jinping thought on the strengthening the military and the party's military strategies in the new era, focus on the goals that the People's Liberation Army needs to accomplish by centenary in 2027, and fulfill tasks given by the party and the people. Speaking at a news conference in Beijing on Saturday, Wang Qiao, the spokesman for the first session of the 14th NPC, said that China's defense budget increase is appropriate and reasonable. The increase in defense spending is needed for meeting the complex security challenges and for China to fulfill its responsibilities as a major country. China's defense spending as a share of GDP has stayed basically stable for many years and is lower than the world average, he said. A country's defense spending is determined based on the overall consideration of the need for its defense building and economic development levels, which is common practice around the world, Wang added. China's future is closely intertwined with that of the entire world. China's military modernization will not be a threat to any other country. On the contrary, it'll only be positive for safeguarding regional stability and world peace, he said. Song Zongping, a military affairs commentator and retired officer of the PLA, said that China's maintained a moderate increase in its defense expenditure for many years, and the nation doesn't seek to get involved in arms races with other countries. Despite the fact that the U.S., some European countries, and Japan have tremendously hiked their military budgets, China has refrained from sharply raising its own budget, though it's fully capable of doing so, Song said. Our country's not like this. or the US and Japan that keep going after military superiority. That's not what we want. China wants a balance in economic development and defense capabilities. The world's largest spender on military affairs in the US is the US. Its defense budget for the year was $858 billion, a year-on-year increase of 11.7%. A large proportion in the military bill will go to Ukraine and China's Taiwan region to strengthen their armed forces, U.S. media reported. In Japan, a record defense budget of 6.8 trillion yen for this year was recently approved by lawmakers, highlighting an astonishing 26% annual increase. And from India Today, China hikes defense budget for 8th consecutive year with 7.2% increase, 3 times higher than India. China on Sunday hiked its defense budget by 7.2%, marginally higher than last year. China last year pegged its defense budget at 1.45 trillion. That was 7.1%, an increase of 7.1%. However, in view of the appreciation of the dollar against the yuan, this year's defense spending of China totaled, according to the state-run China Daily, about 225 billion. Last year, in dollar terms, China's defense spending amounted to 230 billion. So it's actually counting the exchange rate, it's actually less. Relative to the U.S. This is for the 8th consecutive year that China has announced a single-digit percentage point increase in its military budget. In his work report presented to the opening session of the National People's Congress, the country's rubber-stamp parliament outgoing Premier Li Keqiang spoke highly of the armed forces' achievements at the borders without directly referring to the Eastern Ladakh standoff. They carried out operations in a firm and flexible way, and they effectively conducted major missions relating to border defense, to maritime protection, to counterterrorism and stability maintenance, to disaster rescue, and to relief, to COVID-19 response, peacekeeping, merchant ship escorting. All of these things Lee's work report said. The reference to major missions relating to border defense was regarded as significant in the context of offensive actions by the PLA in eastern Ladakh in May 2020 along the line of actual control with India, triggering a prolonged standoff, virtually freezing the relations between the two countries. Both sides held 17 rounds of high-level military talks to resolve the standoff, and the 18th round was expected to take place soon. China is the second biggest spender on defense next to the U.S., whose defense budget for 2023 was $816 billion. From India's point of view, however, China's defense budget continued to be over 3 times higher. India's defense budget for 2023-24 amounted to around $72.6 billion. Aided by increasing defense budgets, the 2 million strong People's Liberation Army, the world's largest military, is increasingly getting powerful and assertive with the ever-expanding military modernization of its army, navy, and air force. The Chinese military is headed by President Xi Jinping, who's the chairman of the powerful Central Military Commission, the overall high command of the PLA. Xi, 69, the only Chinese leader to have been elected for an unprecedented third 5-year term by the ruling Communist Party, CPC, in October last year, also heads the party besides the presidency. Under his leadership, the Chinese military has embarked on a massive military modernization with a goal to be on par with the U.S. Armed Forces in the next few years. The Chinese Navy, the fast expanding arm of the Chinese military, has now 3 aircraft carriers, while its Air Force continued to be modernized with the vast variety of military jets, including stealth jet fighters. Lee's work report also said our national defense mobilization capability was boosted with the efforts we fully safeguarded China's sovereignty, security, and development interests. They stepped up military training, increased combat preparedness, and became a much more modernized and capable fighting force, it said. China's armed forces, with the focus on the goals for the centenary of the PLA in 2027, should work to carry out military operations, boost combat preparedness, and enhance military capabilities, so as to accomplish the tasks entrusted to them by the CPC and the people, Lee said. The armed forces should intensify military training and preparedness. These intensifications should be across the board. They should develop new military strategic guidance, devote greater energy to training under combat conditions, and make well-coordinated efforts to strengthen military work in all directions and domains, Lee said. Ahead of the NPC session, its spokesman Wang Chao on Saturday defended China's steady increases in annual defense budgets, saying that the country's defense spending as a share of the GDP was lower than the world average. China's been ramping up its defense expenditure, and it's vying with the U.S. for global influence. Wang said the increase on the defense budget is needed to meet the complex security challenges for China to fulfill its responsibilities as a major country. China's military modernization will not be a threat to any country, but a positive force safeguarding regional stability and world peace, he said. And from MinaFN.com, China intends to increase its defense budget by 7.2% this year to 1.553 trillion yuan, $224.85 billion, according to a government report released on Sunday at the opening of the first session of the 14th National People's Congress, the supreme legislative body. Other news reports citing TASS. National defense spending is 1.553 trillion yuan this year, with the 7.2% increase, the document said. On the eve, Wang Chao, spokesman for the first session of the 14th National People's Congress, said that the increase in China's defense budget is dictated by the need to respond to complex security challenges as well as the need to fulfill the obligations of a major power. In 2022, China increased defense spending by 7.1%, and in 2021 by 6.8%. Many internal organizations, including the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the SIPRI, believe that China significantly understands the official data on the military budget, while its actual value may be 25 to 50% higher. According to the analysts, the published data do not include several very important items: expenditures on strategic forces, defense research and development, import of foreign weapons, People's Armed Polices, and other paramilitary units. Also, provincial government spending on military expenditures is not included. Wow, yeah, and that's one of the questions that I had, was that, like, where's the delineation between what is military spending and what is non-military spending? You know, a lot of the times the United States will claim that their military pursuances outside of the U.S. are for humanitarian aid. So, I mean, technically, if they saw fit, they could count that in a budget other than a military budget. So that is really interesting. China would be, one of those number counters that would do something like that, and just to make their military budget seem a bit smaller. Very interesting. And from the Daily Sabah, China plans to increase its military spending by 7.2%. The uptick in defense spending is proportionately higher than the planned increase in total expenditure. Uncertainties are on the rise in the external environment. Outgoing Chinese Premier Li Keqiang told the almost 3,000 delegates in the Great Hall of the People he called for the expansion of the country's armed forces, which should boost combat preparedness. This should also boost, other than boost combat preparedness, it should also enhance military capabilities so as to accomplish the tasks entrusted to them by the party and the people. A spokesperson for the meeting a day earlier had justified the above average increase with complex security challenges and China's responsibilities as a great power. Observers have expressed concern at China's growing military might, considering Beijing's threatening posture toward Taiwan. It contested its contested claims in the South China Sea and its growing rivalry with the United States. China's defense budget has repeatedly risen faster than total spending in recent years. Last year, the military budget increased by 7.1%. The focus of the annual week-long meeting of hand-picked delegates is the approval of the planned formation of new government and the setting of the country's economic and political course. China's economic course is expected to increase around 5%, Lee said as he opened this year's session. Following the end of the strict zero-COVID strategy, which had weighed heavily on the world's second largest economy, last year, Lee said he expects China to recover significantly. Last year, the growth rate was around 5.5%. And from C.News, SEE.news, the $224 billion increase in military spending seen by China's neighbors and in Washington as a barometer of how aggressively the country will beef up its military. The hike marks the 8th consecutive single-digit increase. It comes at a time when Beijing's nervous about challenges on fronts ranging from Taiwan to the U.S. naval and air missions in the disputed South China Sea near Chinese-occupied lands. In his work report to the annual session of Parliament, Lee said, military operations, capacity building, and combat preparedness should be well coordinated in fulfilling major tasks. Our armed forces, with the focus on the goals for the centenary of the People's Liberation Army in 2027, should work to carry out military operations, boost combat preparedness, and enhance military capabilities, he said in the State of the Nation address to the largely rubber-stamped legislature. Holding the world's largest military in terms of personnel, China is also adding a slew of new hardware, including aircrafts and stealth fighters. And here we have from Press TV a bit on China.
And welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. One of the news items making the headlines of Western mainstream media outlets is that China is increasing its military budget by 7.2%. What these corporate-owned stations fail to report is that even with this increase in its defense budget, China is still spending just over 1/4 of what the United States spends. China has the second largest defense budget in the world after the U.S. Meanwhile, Washington is warning Beijing about supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine. China's foreign minister has responded by saying it's plain for the world to see who is calling for dialogue and striving for peace and who is adding fuel to the fire, handing out knives and instigating hostility. How dangerous is this scenario? Well, stay with us to find out all of this on this Spotlight. I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. William Jones from Executive Intelligence Review out of Washington, D.C. And John Ross, Senior Fellow, Chang-Yang Institute for Financial Studies out of London. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start it off with William in Washington, D.C. Now, China has said that the reason it's increasing its defense budget is because of the escalating threats from abroad. Your assessment of this reason, is that true? And what does it all mean, really, in this this race for this military increase globally?
Well, I think it's absolutely the case. If you look at what the United States has been doing and its provocation, trying to create new alliances partially of a military character in the Asia Pacific with Japan and Australia, continual and increased incursions into Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea, making a lot of trouble for China in that region. And also the general attempt to strangle China technologically by all the restrictions that are put on high technology products like semiconductors. This is a very hostile policy being imposed by the biggest military power in the world, which has a group of alliances in the so-called Western alliance system that they has brought to bear in terms of putting pressure on China. So obviously, China, which is concerned for its own defense of its own borders, of its own region, has increased its defense budget. It's not as dramatic as the United States. The United States increase in its defense budget, I believe, was 13% as compared to the 7% of the Chinese budget. But of course, the United States is involved in a major war in Europe. China is just trying to defend itself. So that puts that in a much different context. But there is concern because the world situation is very turbulent and very uncertain. This has been made very clear by the Chinese president. And they're kind of, what I say, girding their loins. If any trouble would come, they would be prepared to meet that.
Well, because it's losing in peaceful economic competition. The United States claims its economy is dynamic, etc., but the real reality is that it's losing in the competition to China. I mean, if we take the situation in the pandemic, since the beginning of the pandemic, in the 3 years of the pandemic, China's economy grew 2.5 times as fast as the United States. China grew over 13%, the US just over 5%. If you take the addition to world GDP, in this period, it's 36% to China and about 16% to the United States. Then if you look at the individual companies, the US can't compete in telecommunications with Huawei. TikTok has become the most popular, so therefore the US is trying to ban Huawei. TikTok has become the most visited website in the world, so the US is now considering banning TikTok. Hikvision is the best producer of cameras for surveillance, etc. I mean, for safety surveillance in the world. So the US can't compete with that. The US admits that the whole solar power industry is totally dominated by China. The US is losing in peaceful economic competition. The only place in which it maintains a lead is military, because it's spending more together, so therefore increasingly tends to try to put things on a military terrain. And this is very, very dangerous, because the world wants to get on with peaceful development, but the US wants to move things more and more towards military actions.
Well, William, you just heard what John said. So, I mean, if it's the case that the United States cannot compete, but what they can compete in is with their military, I mean, why wouldn't Washington change its focus? I mean, it was once actually a technologically advanced country. It was the main producer of goods at one point in a time in the world. So wouldn't it make sense for the United States to actually reinvest in the country to actually get it to be more competitive technologically instead of war? I mean, how do you see it?
Well, this would be the rational response to that. The United States, of course, through its own fault, through decisions that have been made over the past decades, has transformed itself from a major industrial power to what I would call a rentier power. They have
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Power of the dollar. So instead of producing steel or other products in Pennsylvania, they shut that down and moved to cheap labor countries that can produce it more cheaply. And this has led to really the deindustrialization of the United States. And if you look at our infrastructure, not to speak of the most dramatic example of our infrastructure was the explosion, the train derailment in Ohio, is an indication of where the United States stands. So everybody is aware of the fact that the U.S. economy has really moved not only in comparison to China, but in comparison to what it once was, from a major power to a economically to a really a second-rate power. And there is an understanding that there should be this infrastructure development, but it's happening in the context of this competition with China, which is making it impossible for them politically to get people together to move toward a program of a revitalization of the U.S. economy, which would create a little more confidence and a little less warlike bearing on the part of our politicians, who, as John Ross indicated, are really frightened that they've become a secondary power. But the United States policymakers are not thinking rationally in this respect. They had an opportunity also, even with China's Belt and Road initiative, that was also offered to the United States. They were prepared to help build high-speed rail in the U.S., and that was rejected because it was China doing it and not the United States doing. So it's their own folly which has led them to a policy which is restrictive, is punitive, and could lead to war, rather than a policy of trying to rebuild the economic potential of the United States. And that's put the world in a real dilemma at this point.
And we'll be back with more world news